let's start with a little bit of background. Guy and I are both labor economists, and we are often asked to talk about the monthly job situation the minute that it comes out. I'm actually typically on a Bloomberg live feed as the data is released, and someone else is pulling up the data in a Bloomberg terminal, and then we're expected to react to it. It's incredibly stressful. And it's very it's hard to parse so much data. So I don't know about your spreadsheet, but I have 3 jobs day spreadsheets, and it's thousands of data series that will take me a long time to go through. So the motivation for having this jobs day debrief is that with less stress and more chat, Guy and I can go through what we learned this morning. So that said, I can give I can give a preview. Although I suppose we should introduce ourselves because you have followers and I have followers here. So we should introduce ourselves to each other's followers.
Yeah, sure. You
Okay.
go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm Kathryn Anne Edwards, and I'm an economist. And I currently run my own consulting shop. And I have a podcast, Optimist Economy, and I write for Bloomberg Opinion. And I have a newsletter, Keds.
So first, you guys should all subscribe to Keds because Kathryn Anne is awesome and super smart. So that kudos out of the way. Guy Berger, labor economist. I wear a lot of hats these days. I'm kind of in Kathryn Anne's world that I do a fair amount of consulting. I'm chief economist at Homebase, which is does a lot of Main Street small business hourly employee ops. I am a senior advisor on labor markets at Axis Macro with my friend Tim Mahedi. I am workforce economist at residence at Guild in the ed tech space, and I am also a senior fellow at the Burning Glass Institute. That's a lot of stuff, but basically I'm a giant addict of labor market data. This week, when we get jolts in the BLS report, is like my highlight every month, and then in the intervening weeks, I'm like a labor market junkie looking for a fix. I'm staring at all sorts of other data. And yeah, I think that's a good characterization.
Oh, okay. So sidebar, we'll have to talk about this offline. I studied abroad with Tim Mahedi.
Oh, no way.
He and I go back to like college. Okay, so jobs report. It is the first Friday of the month. And so the report that just came out is the summary data from the last month. This survey data is from 2 types. One is household, one is establishment. And they each tell us a little bit of a different picture. Establishments or employers, they're asked about the people who are working, their hours and their wages. And the household surveys of people, and it's asking them about their jobs and activity, where they're working, how much they're working. These things don't always match. They don't always give us the same picture, and they can be quite confusing. In some ways, the establishment data, the business data, is a little bit more straightforward. And the survey is larger, so people tend to defer to it, but people are always more interesting than businesses. And so my favorite survey is the household survey. But
Nice.
each jobs day is arguably a little bit meaningless because it's just 1 month of data. And what you're really looking for is some type of update on a trend that you were following or worried about. So any one jobs day number can be just excused as like, well, we don't know, it's a blip or what have you. It's really as things accumulate. But there tends to be a judgment call of, was this a good or bad report? This was a bad one.
Yeah, I'd say it's a bad one. I think not necessarily quite as bad as I've seen some people say, but I don't think definitely would not characterize it. I think it's one of the weaker ones we've gotten this year.
Yes. So the trend in the US economy, as told through the jobs report over the last year and a half, has been the US economy is essentially treading water. Like on every measure, we're basically standing close to still. And on any given month, the data, it's almost like the mean is 0 and it's jumping up around it. So we'll have a month that it goes up and then it goes back down, where unemployment goes up and then unemployment goes down. Labor force goes up and then it goes back down. And sometimes those jumps are big, but then it tends to correct. And we are really at a $30 trillion economy that is about as close to holding steady as you can get. And it's been this way for about a year and a half.
Yeah,
So
I think if I were sorry, Kathryn Anne, I
no,
interrupted you.
go ahead.
I guess it's funny because like I'm somebody who probably spends too much time staring at this stuff and attaching meaning to small wiggles. And so if I were to like tweak that a tiny bit, I would say that if I were to split the past year into two halves, the second half of 2025 relative to holding steady, things got a little worse. I mean, we saw things, the unemployment rate go up a little bit. We saw hiring go down a little bit. Employment growth was weak. And then the first 6 months of this year, I think we're sort of maybe returning back to that holding steady trend. Things improved a little bit. The unemployment rate fell. We saw better job growth. I think the question when you look at this report, and I think it's probably what we're going to get into, first, maybe that was all noise, but like, are we returning back to that cooling trend? Is that that small, but I think real, but small improvement we saw in the first half sustainable or not? I personally was surprised. I didn't think we were going to see improvement, even a little improvement this year. I mean, I didn't think it was going to be a terrible year. I didn't think it was going to be. And I think today's report kind of raises that question of like, are the brief good times? I don't know. Better,
Green
slightly,
shoots, green
marginally
shoots.
better.
I've heard them referred to as this, that the jobs report for the past year and a half has been like a green shoot that gets like mowed down in the next report, and we had some green shoots in the latter half that are being mowed down. So two ways to present the data, I think. One is to make a case and then find the data points that agree with you. And the other is to just examine a data point and see what case it makes. Almost all the coverage you're going to see is going to be that first type, but I think Guy and I are much more of the second type of like, I just want to know what data is out there and what it says. So let me read the headlines and then we can take turns talking about interesting data. The total non-farm payroll employment, which is the number of jobs, not the number of people working, because it doesn't include the self-employed, but total non-farm payroll employment fell by $23,000, or $23,000, 23,000 jobs, and the unemployment rate was at 4.1%. Those are the headlines. The payroll employment interpretation, losing jobs is bad. I mean, that one's pretty easy. You don't want to shed jobs. There are a couple excuses that can be given around this, like which sectors they were lost from and to what degree. But if the economy is strong, we don't lose jobs. Like there's ways to soften this interpretation of like, well, in the summer, school teachers are out and that can show up weird in the employment report, or like we had a World Cup here and that messes with leisure and hospitality. But if the economy is doing really well, we don't have to make those type of excuses. So I can think of ways to soften this number, but losing jobs in a month is bad. Yeah.
I agree with the asterisk that because I mean, we've had very restrictive immigration policy over the past year and a half. And so this number, while I agree is bad, it is, if we had seen this number 2 or 3 years ago, it would be really bad. And instead, I mean, I was trying to think like what would be my benchmark. I think my reaction to this number is the way I would react to like a plus 75,000 number 2 years ago. We would have found that
Hmm.
number to be quite disappointing. I don't think we would react to it as catastrophic. And I think that's one aspect I think of softening that I do think is worth keeping in mind is that the where we it is appropriate to grade someone on a curve given labor supply growth has slowed down. And I think that's the one asterisk, but I agree with you. Even under circumstances where you're like, you know what, labor supply growth has slowed down, minus 23,000 is still a bad number. It's
Yeah,
not a terrible.
it's not catastrophic, but it's not good. There's
Yeah.
not a ton to brag about here. There's a lot to make excuses about, but there's not a ton to brag about. Um, the rest of the establishment survey showed, I think, a few things that were also really unsettling. One of them is that it measures wage growth in the economy, and wage growth was basically flat over the month and it was 3.2 over the year. And the reasons why that's bad is that that's nominal wage growth. It doesn't take into account the change in prices over that time. So if we have a inflation report that comes out at 3.5 and wages come in at 3.1, well, now everybody in the US is on average worse off. So this has been a problem in the labor market, is that we have not had a tight enough labor market to bid up wage growth faster than the inflation we're seeing. And this report really drives home that workers are worse off in any month where their wages don't rise fast enough.
Yeah, and I think so. One of the things I've sort of been trying to figure out. It's surprising, to be honest. Like, it just seems like This year, we are seeing a sharp, precipitous decline. I know there was some very smart people that I know, like Matt Klein, have sort of looked at it and tried to decompose it, say, is it because it seems like a lot of it, for example, is coming from healthcare. My general feeling is like I'm not really a big fan of cherry. I mean, not criticizing Matt because Matt is amazing and one of the best detailed people on data, but like in the sense of like I don't wouldn't say that well, we just pull out this sector and therefore wage growth is not slowing. I just think it's interesting detail. I do think one thing that's going on that I think is a partial explanation, but is not big enough to explain this deceleration is we are also seeing benefit costs accelerate, particularly healthcare. I mean, those of you guys that have to look at your health insurance premiums for the last few years know this. And I think that probably takes at least a little bite out of your potential raise. But there's no, I just look at that and I'm like, fine, fair enough. But like, there's no you just can't explain the magnitude of the deceleration that we're seeing in wage growth with that. That would explain maybe a little bit of it. Like my feeling is like with all these things that are a little negative, a lot of them you can sort of soften it a little bit, as Kathryn Anne said. I don't think you can fully soften it. So
And the problem with wage growth is that it tends to be the faster growing wages are people switching jobs. That pulls up the average. So like you in your job from 1 month to the next, you tend to have jumps, right? Like you make money and then you get a raise, and you make money and you get a raise. Whereas people who are switching jobs, most job switches, although it can go down, most job switches are associated with an increase in pay. So what's really happening when you see wage growth diminish is that that switching process isn't happening enough to bring up wages. But we've seen that for the past year and a half too, because hiring has also cratered relative to prior levels. And so this is just showing that there's not enough movement in the job market to get people higher wages. And at the same time, you've got this like downward pressure from these massive compensation costs like health insurance. So that's not good. And then the last thing I would say is that sometimes the jobs numbers can look one way, but hours look different because jobs is the number of people you have on payroll, and hours are how many hours they're actually working. And so it could be that like, well, maybe the payroll growth isn't going up, but everybody's working more. And so you are seeing some expansion to we would think of this almost as like labor demand because you have a lot of people pulling in extra hours, but you didn't see that either. I didn't really see anything of interest or good on the hours front.
I mean, the only thing I'd say is hours have gone, and it's surprising because for a while I had not looked at it, and they, and I started looking again this spring, and they have gone up a little bit relative to last year, which I think is after a long period of going down, which is consistent with the story that again, maybe I'm reaching a sad, whimper of an end in the second half of the year that like, the worsening in the labor market stopped at some point in the past year and maybe even showed very tiny signs of like trying to turn things around that I hope I'm wrong, but I worry are not going to last as we move into the second half of the year.
Yeah, I worry about that too. So that's the establishment side. I think while we're doing an overview, now we can move to the household side. So the household side, I think the story is almost the question is how is unemployment so low? With the labor market this week, there's just this really like, I don't understand how unemployment can be low and even falling to 4.1 when job growth is so weak, when hours really aren't expanding, when wage growth is minimal, but you're not seeing it show up on the unemployment side. One part of that is that people are leaving the labor force. And the prime age, which is ages 25 to 54, when we think people are mostly done with school but not yet into retirement, the prime age workforce has seen huge hits in labor force participation just over the past few months, even though they are currently near record highs for how much people 25 to 54 are working. It is starting to show, I would say, almost 3 months of a trend. 3 months make a trend. 4 months make a recession, 3 months make a trend. It's declining. So it's if unemployment's falling, it can fall for good reasons or bad reasons. It's falling for a bad reason.
I'd say the only caution, because I'm like, I have a lot to, especially I've been thinking about it a lot. The first is I actually do take the decline in the employment population ratio and participation rate for prime working age. I mean, it's declined the last 2 months. It fell a lot last month, almost entirely concentrated in people ages like I think 25 to 29. It was like a weird thing in that one which I think sort of raised it when you. I'd expect it to be more diffuse. But anyway, rebound a little bit. It is down. I do think that jumping, and maybe I'm jumping the gun to stuff you're going to talk about. What would worry me here if we saw unemployment going down and we thought the labor market getting worse, I would look, for example, do we see the number of people that are not in the labor force and want a job and are ready to work? These are people called the marginally attached go up. And we saw it go up a little bit this month. So I guess you could say that some of the decrease in unemployment was sort of misleading, but I don't think it's a weird it's my feeling is the precipitation stuff is weird because it on the one hand, it doesn't look good. On the other hand, some of the alarm bells that I would expect to be associated with it, if it was sort of this big hidden source of labor market distress, are not ringing or ringing, like, extremely faintly.
Yeah, so the survey, like, let's just take time to give flowers to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but the survey should be able to find people as they leave the labor force
Yep.
is what Guy is saying, that if you are actively searching for a job in the last 4 weeks, which is really since the last survey, you're unemployed. But if you stop looking, we should still be counting you. And there's been a bit of a disconnect between people who are not unemployed, but they're not showing up in the not counting or in the not searching piles. And those piles should be larger. This is a technical economics term. The piles of people aren't big enough, but they're really not. We should have like discouraged or marginally attached kind of growing in tandem, but they're not. It is a really small series. You know, the smaller the series gets, the smaller the group gets, the jumpier the number can be because of standard errors. But it is still, I think, a little bit of a mystery to me how people could be leaving the labor force and not showing up more and marginally attached.
I mean, they're sort of saying, I mean, essentially the way you're seeing is people are leaving and they're not telling us they want a job. Like, that's sort of, and again, some of it is retirements, but I don't think the very recent behavior, like, it's not that. It's like, I mean, my joke last month, which I actually don't believe, was that a bunch of 25, 29-year-olds quit their jobs to, like, watch the World Cup for a month and are gonna come back. But I don't really believe it was a facetious comment. I don't think that's what's happening, but it is kind of an odd, mysterious thing.
Oh, no, no, but Guy, you're totally right. So the BLS measures the series is called "Wants a Job." Like,
Yep.
it's the WAJ, right? Do you want a job? And the number of people who are not working who want a job is smaller this month than it was this time last year, even though their labor force participation has fallen. So they're just like, "No, I'm good. I don't want a job." Now they do try to ask about this. They ask about caregiving needs, disability, illness, you know, other things, but it's still not such a small group that I think that those bucket remainder categories of like, well, where did you go? I think they're not being as informative as I would like because they're not increasing as much or showing the obvious decrease from unemployment. And this is a real mystery. I was staring at the want a job numbers right as why don't you want a job numbers was I was looking at right when I realized I was late for this call. Okay, so any other, and by the way, some people have been putting questions in the chat. If you have questions, you can put them in. Um, any other household stuff that you
Yeah,
found?
one thing, and this is, like, very I'm gonna torture people with, like, a very detailed but actually important point. I think one thing that people are centered on, and again, I think it's good people are thinking about this. As you can see from Kathryn and I's discourse, we're not exactly sure why, but big focus on labor force participation falling. One weird thing is the BLS every year updates their estimates using census population data. And the way they do it is unusual. They don't, in the household survey, they don't do historical revisions. They just kind of do a one update at the beginning of the year with the new population estimates and it generates discontinuities. And this year, they actually basically said, we've been overestimating labor force participation since 2020 until the end of 2025 by about half a percentage point. So some of the decline over the past year, let's say half, give or take, is actually just an artifact. And I think the point being that some of these things that seem negative are maybe somewhat exaggerated. And it's like a really technical point. I don't want to dwell too much, but if you see somebody doing like a year-over-year comparison of the participation rate and saying, oh, it's declined so much, just know some of that is exaggerated and not actually real. Some of it, about I'd say about half, give or take, and especially the part this year since January is real. Like, it's happening. I don't want to discount that. Just that for longer horizons, that estimate is somewhat exaggerated. I'm sorry, technical data nerd interlude over.
No, it's really important to note that, I feel like we're in this era that I don't love, where people just love to dunk on public survey data, and it's just like he fired the head of the BLS, and then there's issues with survey collection, and so it's just this easy thing to do to be like, well, that's just another example of why these surveys are no good. And I think that the set that leaves people with is like this idea that either the numbers aren't trustworthy or something about it is changing. When truly, like, every January there's a reset to the population, and you have to be careful comparing year over year. And that's always been true. I remember that when I was a research assistant at 22, they would say, like, you have to be really careful comparing December to January because there's going to be population controls. And it's almost like now that people are like, they're zeroed in and trying to find mistakes in the data, and they hold that up as evidence of the household surveys or the establishment surveys being in trouble, as opposed to these are how these things work. It's an estimate, and those estimates, those caveats have always been there. There are things that are problematic, but I think yeah, you never compare December to January in the the
And
household
the other
surveys. There's
thing
not a lot to
about
it.
it is just, I mean, part of it, I mean, yes, it's gotten harder to collect the data because survey response rates are falling. They've fallen a lot, but also the economy since like 2020 has behaved in lots of weird ways. And I'd almost think of it as a car where there are a lot of, it's a very complex car and it runs. And the cars started to behave weird in lots of ways that we took for granted. Like, population estimates used to be something that's kind of just humming in the background. You're aware the BLS is updating it, but or the census is updating it, but it's not. It doesn't. It's not the kind of thing that will fundamentally change your understanding of how things are going. And now all of a sudden we're discovering, you know what? Having huge fluctuations in immigration is a hard thing for the Census Bureau to estimate. Having, I mean, if all we have projections for the population right now from census that have some assumptions built in, and, like, we might not know for quite a while whether those are correct, and census in a year will update them again. And I think it's a hard again, all these underlying assumptions that used to be not very material and now suddenly matter a lot and
Yeah.
affect our understanding. You have to think about, I mean, I'm sorry to say, tell everyone because I wish it wasn't true, but, like, understanding them suddenly has become much more important. I will say that personally for me, I used to, like, been caught multiple times the last few years, sort of saying something and then realizing that I was, like, not aware of some big change underlying the data that made my conclusion wrong.
Yeah, so this is the part that's on some level wild to me, is that we don't have a consensus here in the summer of 2026 of how many jobs the US economy needs to be adding in a month. It was a relatively staid and agreed upon statistics because it's a function of the growth in the working age population. If you have, a half a million more people every month who are going to enter the workforce, you need to make that many jobs or more. Well, that count is completely I don't it's almost inestimable at the moment, because although population declines, like the number of working age population declines, like people retire and there are a lot of baby boomers, that's relatively easy to predict and see a long way coming. But we have little idea what's happening with immigration and the population of a very vital part of our workforce in real time. And so, I mean, Guy's point that losing 20,000 jobs in a month would be catastrophic in earlier eras is really just, the way to interpret the jobs number is its distance from the benchmark of, like, this is the number you need to hit and this is where you are. And the closer the number gets to zero, the more likely you'd pick up some negative there. Well, we don't even know where that number is supposed to be. I've seen estimates as low as 15,000. I've seen some people say it still needs to be 120, but it makes this interpretation really hard. I don't know. But all right, we've been doing this for about a half hour. I feel like we should answer some questions. I'm gonna ask and answer one, and then have and not cut you off guard, because y'all should know, guys and I prepped for this was, do you want to talk on Friday? Cool, and that's about it. We didn't go over
It's
like
been good so far, though. I'm having
I
fun. I
yeah,
hope you're having fun, and I hope we're not the
but
numbers of viewers seems to be growing a little bit, so we haven't made everybody fall asleep.
Oh, that's that's good. So I would say one series that I'd like to look at on Jobs Day, not because I expect it to change very much, but because I think it gives us some type of indication of certain weaknesses in the economy. I look at the percent of the employed who are holding more than one job. So the establishment survey counts jobs, and the household survey counts workers. That could be off for big reasons, like if you're self-employed, you don't have a job, you have an income. And so you're self-employed, you don't show up in the payroll survey because you're not on payroll. So a lot of independent contractors, your Uber, Lyft drivers, they're not there. On the household side, if you're holding 2 payroll jobs, you're in the establishment survey twice and you're in the household survey once. And the establishment survey, or in the household survey, they ask people, "Do you have more than one employer?" So we have this count of multiple job holding in our economy. Now, historically, it's been at higher levels, but the data doesn't go back too far. It only goes back to the '90s, where it's always been somewhere between 4.5 and 6%, but it is higher now. It's around 5.4. That's higher than it was 2 years ago. Like, we are seeing a steady drift in the number of people who are holding 2 jobs. Coming out of the pandemic, it was close to 4.5%. Now it's a point higher. That number is not gonna change much month to month, but it's a big benchmark for me of things like we're not seeing wages grow in the establishment survey, and that makes sense on some level why we're seeing more multiple job holding in the household survey if people are holding down 2 jobs. And for what it's worth, women are much more likely to be holding 2 jobs than men, and they're much more likely to have a full-time, part-time job as opposed to 2 part-time jobs. So the 2 part-time jobs is actually less common than having a full-time job and a separate part-time job, and women are more likely to hold them. So it's a kind of a basic measure of, just that's not good. Not getting it means you didn't get enough money from one job and you have to go get another one, and that's not good. So that number has been pretty stubborn over the past year and a half, just stays high.
Yeah, I think I've always been interested in this data because I never have a very strong prior belief on what's good and what's bad. So, for example, let's pick a very specific thing that I tend to look at, which is a small subset, which is people holding more than one full time job. And then what's interesting is that it tends to go up as labor market gets. I mean, their variation tends to go up when labor market's good and go down. And the reason is that, like, my feeling is a bad job market, the overriding characteristic of it is I could not find enough work. Right?
Right.
And there's nuance here, right? So, like, in some sense, when you can't find a job, the idea, wow, I could find 2 jobs. I mean, I'm being facetious here because I think the ideal is that we have one job and we don't have to switch and it gives us enough hours, enough pay to support ourselves and our family. So I don't like kind of want us to be Pollyannish about it. And I think in a really good job market, this is purely a choice thing that people that want to work more than one job can, and people that don't and get what they need out of their job, one job. But I do think that I never really, if the job market suddenly took a sharp turn for the worse, would we see more or fewer people working more than one job? And Anne is about to jump in and tell me the answer. But I guess that's sort of it. That's what I always wonder about these things is like, what would I think a good number, a bad number is in these series? Especially because there does seem to be a longer run trend of more flexibility. Remote work probably facilitates people having more than one job as well because commuting times have fallen. Kathryn Anne, go ahead. You're going to tell
So
me why I need to think about this harder.
multiple job holding falls during recessions because there's fewer jobs available for you to hold. And it tends to, when the economy is not in recession, it tends to track inversely with wage growth. So people
Interesting.
pick up second jobs when they don't make enough from their first job. So it's very much a, you know, and it's younger people tend to do it more than older people, and so the actual, like, inclination to work multiple jobs can change with underlying demographics, making, like, really long-term studies interesting, but, no, if you're thinking about multiple job holding since the '90s, it would go down in recessions and then go up as people recover and then don't earn enough, and so you definitely see it during periods of weak wage growth. And the number that's reported in the job survey, or the jobs day, it's not capturing most multiple job or all multiple job holding. If you have like more detailed household surveys that don't come out every month, like the SIP, you can see multiple job holding on several fronts. And the SIP used to have a question, not only like, do you have a job? Do you have another job? Do you run a business? Do you have another business? It also just asked people like, do you ever moonlight? Just like side hustle moonlight. The rates were
Yeah.
like, yes, moonlighting was like a very they dropped it from the next SIP, but moonlighting was always like 5% of people would be like, I got something going on.
Yeah, I think there
I got
was.
money coming in. I'm selling labor you don't know about. Like there was always moonlighting too.
Do you think can I ask you a question? This is something that, for example, like, one of the things that we've got a few questions here about gig employment. And
Mhm.
theoretically, by the way, if you are gig employed, it depends on what specifically the relationship is with the employer. You might not show up in the establishment survey, like the non-farm payroll count. You might, in certain cases, you would definitely show up in the household survey because you would be self-employed. I think that's sort of the main distinction, but you show up. But the one thing I kind of want, and by the way, the other weird thing is we've seen people think about the gig economy, but like self-employment broadly defined has fallen a lot as its importance over the past few decades. This kind of surprises people because I think there is a lot of informal gig type work that has existed since the beginning of time, since humans learned how to write, to crack rocks together. No, but like has existed, and I think just becomes less common as the economy becomes more formalized. Um, but I do. Catherine made a great point that some of that activity earns income, people don't really think of it as work. And so when they get asked about their job, say I'm house sitting for my neighbor and they're paying me like a neighborhood kid or something. Like, does that get answered as a work? Almost certainly not. And I think there's some of that. And the thing is, what people think about as modern gig work is probably actually more likely to be caught at least as self-employed. Like somebody is more if I'm doing it through Rover, I'm more likely to think of it as my job than if I was just like a random neighborhood kid doing it for my neighbors. I don't know, but it's like there also have weird counterintuitive ways in the ways people think about work that affect how these surveys catch it in different ways.
Well, and something like Uber or Lyft is doing two things. It's formalizing an informal contract that has always existed, as well as increasing the number of contracts. And so the effect of these companies, even like TaskRabbit or all of them, they're taking two things. They're moving in two directions. And I think the first one of like you're replacing what was already there to a certain degree. That part gets, I think, overlooked when you see these massive numbers of people who are, driving for Uber. But if you go back, before these online platforms for gig contract work, you still had huge numbers of people who would say, like, I moonlight, I earn money sometimes, but they didn't do it through a platform. I was about to say regulated, but it ain't that. Okay, so we got a couple questions about immigration, and one was I scrolled through it, but one was if something like this. Sorry, chat, if I got this wrong. If immigrants are leaving the United States, if we're having a net loss of immigrants and we are not having as hold on, let me try it one more time. The decline in immigration that we think we saw last year was driven by a decline in legal immigration. So there's the deportation story that's going to have a chilling effect on people coming through unauthorized means, but there has also been a massive clampdown on authorized legal immigration. It is much bigger, and it is much more problematic for our labor market that legal immigration that is often work oriented is also falling. So the question was, who's taking these jobs if immigrants are not here as much? You should know that the foreign-born unemployment rate is falling and has been falling. So the BLS measures they'll ask you where your parents were born. And so they know if you're native born or foreign born. Foreign born is going to include the, roughly 25 million naturalized citizens to the US. So it doesn't mean that they're not a citizen or they're not a legal permanent resident. But the unemployment rate for, foreign born and native born has been tracking relatively close for a long time. Often foreign born is a little higher until you get to 2026. And in the last year, or I guess that's the last 6 months, the foreign-born unemployment rate has fallen and the native-born unemployment rate has increased to the point where they're a point apart from each other. Foreign-born is at 3.6, native-born is at or foreign-born is at 3.3, native-born is at 4.6. I just said a lot of numbers really quickly. Let me try this one more time. The foreign-born unemployment rate right now is 3.3%, and over a point higher is the native-born unemployment rate at 4.6. Who are taking the jobs that immigrants aren't taking is other immigrants.
It's true.
It's other immigrants, right? And we're basically culling the immigrant population, but that is not changing the way that people work in the US. And so now we're just increasing demand on a shrinking group of people or a relatively shrinking group of people to the point where their unemployment rate is drastically falling. And to have an unemployment rate fall a point and a half as much as theirs has, that is a precipitous decline in an unemployment rate, and it is really amongst foreign-born workers.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, like, the way I almost think about it is we had this. It's the right thing. And I always think of it as almost like we had this huge immigration wave, and it takes time to absorb new workers. And we had faster job growth because the job market was absorbing them, but it took a while. And now all of a sudden, that immigration flows have halted. Kathryn Anne is totally right that the immigration restriction story is far more about the low profile decline in inflows than about the very high profile. And I think I have very strong opinions about what we've seen out of Minnesota. This is an econ talk, but I'll spare. But like in general, the high profile like deportations are a much smaller chunk of the story. There's also some subsidiary stories here that I don't have a great handle on. What about immigrants that are actually in the US and are scared to work um, because of this? And I mean, maybe that explains some of the decline in labor force participation rate and therefore would kind of weigh. I mean, I don't know, but I do wonder about that. Actually, look, we have labor force participation for immigrants versus domestic for native born, and I haven't looked at it. So maybe the data rules like telling a guy you're making stuff up or penciling him right. It can also be affecting, by the way, people's response rates. Maybe our accuracy in measuring the foreign-born population's labor force status is getting worse because people are scared to answer the phone because the person on the line says, "I'm your labor status." They think, "Oh, this could be somebody who's coming to like chase me and my family down." So I just think in general, this is we're in a messy measurement environment. And I think what Catherine had said about the unemployment rates, like if you were hoping that immigration restriction would have a very favorable effect on the native born unemployment rate, that has not happened.
Mm-mm, mm-mm. Yeah. Robin and I doomed ourselves by calling our podcast Optimist Economy. And we have like we've actually had some like failed attempts where like we've tried to record an episode on immigration, but not wanting to just drastically bring down our viewers. We've like scrapped the episode because it is so hard to talk about this without getting and keep an even keel to just be like, hey, let me explain to you the way that immigrants work in our labor market. They work a lot. So that's the problem if you're, actively demonizing them. It's very hard to maintain your cool. So I see you trying to like talk about this in an economic way and not like absolutely lose it because there's a lot of just that anyway, I see it. I struggle with it too. Okay. So were there other questions for the chat that you saw?
Yeah, I think there was one that I think is very like narrow, which is on ADP versus non-farm payrolls, and I'll throw out one other source, which is Revelio, which is a labor market data firm, is not producing their own non-farm payrolls forecast. There'll be other ones I'm overlooking. ADP is the most prominent, and the question is ADP telling us a better picture of the labor market than non-farm payrolls and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I would say let me say that I'm trying to think of the right way to say this. I don't think so, but I don't think this is a negative thing about ADP. Is I personally like having multiple sources measuring things, and I think I think the question is rightly conceived as in we should think of these as two separate sources trying to measure something rather than like what traditionally ADP was set up as, I think unfairly, as like a nowcast of non-farm payrolls. My feeling is they're both good to have. If they disagree, your prior should be like, should these things converge in the medium run? If ADP is running a little stronger, for example, which it has been in the last 2 months, my inclination would be I don't think that that very low numbers in non-farm payroll employment are just gonna continue indefinitely. Like, my feeling is, like, it's probably the case that non-farm payrolls will probably be converged a little closer where ADP is, and that ADP numbers are probably gonna head down further, and I think that's probably the approach, is think holistically here. You have a whole range of data, and by the way, for a lot of people that are kind of rolling their eyes saying, "What the heck is ADP?" If you don't know, consider yourself blessed because you probably have a healthy natural relationship with market data. But the point is that, like, for those of you, the labor market nerds, I actually the approach these days, I think it was really enforced during the government shutdown when the government sadly stopped releasing statistics, is like we have all these sources. None of them is the gospel truth, but collectively we can get an okay. Same thing with like Kathryn saying that she looks like 1,000 data series when the report comes out. Like, it's very easy to cherry pick specific numbers, or sometimes even to get misled by the headline numbers. But I think looking at the range of them, you can form a holistic, not by the way, entirely internally consistent, but you can sort of see here are the main threads here. Here are things that next month and compared to last month, I can expect to see, et cetera. And so my feeling with these, both of them agree that employment growth has slowed substantially in the last few months. One of them is more upbeat, one of them is more downbeat. Probably the truth is somewhere in the middle. And in 6 months, we'll probably not be wondering why did these numbers disagree. We'll probably think, wow, they finally came to an agreement over a medium length of time.
Yeah. Okay, we got one that is what is missing from labor market data sources that you wish you had the answer? Do you wish you had to answer the questions you have? Known unknowns that could be solved with better or different data. All right, few things immediately come to mind. The JOLTS, the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, is a sample of the establishment survey that we get every month on Jobs Day. The reason why it comes out with a lag is because it's kind of like conducted as a separate survey, and it's a much smaller sample. Um, it doesn't have to be. We could add those job openings and all of the jolts could be totally folded into Jobs Day, and we could have that number, so we have, the number of jobs added right next to hires and openings. Right? We could have all of that together. Again, almost everything standing in the way of the Bureau of Labor Statistics is money and permission. And they don't really have either, but they could do that. The other thing is that we have job openings. It's a very specific report of like, do you have an available job right now? The job has to be available to fill and so forth. That series is really hard to look at over time because there used to be something called the Help Wanted Index, where they would pull from newspapers, from the classifieds. They'd come up with a measure of help wanted. And now Indeed and other private sources are trying to come up with different measures of job openings. But what we've never had, which you could construct in various ways, is some type of like opening quality index. Like, how many applications are these openings receiving? On average, how many applications are going in per opening, as opposed, because what's typically held up is the number of unemployed people per job opening. And there have been many points in our economy where we've been underwater and there are fewer jobs than there are unemployed people. We've kind of fallen below that lately, and people will point that to, well, no one wants to work. Obviously they don't. But there's no quality measure of the opening and how it could change over time, or how the relationship between opening and application changes over time. For a long time, I wanted to have some type of job seeker labor regulation where you have to do basic reporting requirements for the jobs that you post. And that would generate a lot of data on the back end of how many people applied for this job. And did you use a computer algorithm to sort them? So I went and talked to a Senate office staff, and I told them they were working on like AI protection for workers. And I was like, you need to get this into the job, like into the job application side. And you need to get some data generated on the back end, that in order to prove that it was not just an AI algorithm that got people not hired, that you need to give the number of people applying to each job. Because I think that number changes a ton and we have no idea.
Yeah. I mean, dude, it's funny. I wrote in the chat that you were describing utopia. To me, having a richer, I mean, I'll pick something. I was going to say, my answer to the question was going to be something else, but to riff on this a little bit. It's something because I recently discovered there's something called the quarterly workforce indicators that Census publishes. with like a big multi-quarter lag that you can create like almost like partial like jolts at a very detailed level, like for like small micro industries. And I have this project I'm working on in the background that I've been saying I'd finish for like 3 months on behalf of myself that I haven't. I've made very halting progress with the help of my friend Claude. Um, Claude Opus and Claude. Anyway, but what I was going to say was that so I would love to have more detailed data. I think everything Kathryn Anne says here is amazing of a better jolts. I do think that on the topic of AI, what I would love to do, and there is some data on this. You can use job postings. Maybe you can use LinkedIn or Indeed could do it using their profile histories. I would be interested in measures of occupate within occupational transformation.
Mm.
What I mean is, I mean, there's sort of the story of which jobs AI is destroying, which jobs is AI creating. They're very hard to interpret using the layoff and hiring data because we can't. There's no easy way to attribute those things to AI. I think people tend to attribute them to AI, but I don't think is this a hard would be a hard thing to measure, even if you ask people, "Are you doing this because of AI or not?" Um, but I think things like the pace of task or skills content within occupations is something you can measure. And if you started seeing that change, for example, I'll pick something very specific because I think even though I think AI is impact on the labor market has so far been relatively small, it clearly has impacted software development by quite a bit. What a software developer does now and what tools they use or so what they used 5, 6 years ago is quite different because they're probably writing a lot less code themselves. And so I think that will be where I would expect to see change. As AI transforms more parts of the economy, I would expect to see other jobs change too. And I think that's sort of the story historically is that for a lot of occupations, their tasks. I was reading an article about shoemakers, I think in Justin Wolfer's latest Substack, where he's like, the Industrial Revolution radically changed bootmaking in Britain. There was an enormous number of bootmakers in Britain in the 19th century. Their jobs changed a lot due to industrialization, but the number of them did not change. And so I think those kinds of measures on a higher frequency, if you want to know how AI is changing the economy, that change in the job bundle of tasks and activities would be extremely useful. And I don't think we have some people are trying to do it, but I don't think we have great sources for it.
Mm. All right, a few things from the chat. Francisco is saying that we have something called the labor leverage ratio. It was a index that was constructed by Aaron Sojourner, who we all love.
Great economist.
Great economist, nice guy. It is not. It is using JOLTS data and presenting a new index where it shows the ratio of quits that the worker initiates versus layoff and discharges that the employer initiates. And so, if you put these into ratio, you have what he calls the leverage ratio, but it's really a measure of worker power. Like what's driving the labor market: workers exercising their right to quit, or employers exercising their right to lay off or discharge. And you can see how that changes over time. It maps recessions. The labor leverage ratio has been falling since the spring of 2022. And so many aspects of our labor market look like we have gone through a recession, but the numbers are so high or so low that it's not actually a recession. Like the increase in the unemployment rate, the decline in hires, the decline in worker power, the decline in all of this looks like a recession, but the numbers are so close to a strong labor market that it's not going to be called a recession, which I think I actually suspect that for like years, labor economists will be wondering, did we just go through a recession? Even though the unemployment rate was still so low, to have a slowdown in the labor market to the degree that we saw, even coming from a very strong place. Was this a recession? The labor leverage ratio shows that. The other response was from Erica. I suspect McIntarfer, even though it just says Erica, because she says she asked Kathryn Abraham, who is a professor of economics at the University of Maryland, who's done a ton of work on surveys, why the JOLT is not part of the establishment survey that feeds into the jobs day. And Kathryn said it was because of response burden in the establishment survey. If you add enough questions, the response rate will go down. So it's better to not jeopardize the big survey and just add one separately, which like that totally sounds like a really reasonable and Kathryn Abraham response of like, this is better. You just want too much. And she's right. Probably risking response rates in the main survey would be a lie. I once asked at a census forum around the 2010 census, why don't they add more questions to the CTS? And I swear to God, the economist laughed in my face of like, add questions to the survey. Are you kidding me? It was pretty funny. But yeah, you make the survey too hard, you don't get as many people respond. So it is always about trade-offs, even on the formation of the survey, not just the interpretation of the data.
I mean, I wonder if the BLS has experimented with if you gave people a mini CPS, whether the response rate would improve. I don't know if that's the cause of falling response rate. I think some of it might be just it's harder to reach people and people block phone numbers they don't recognize, etc. But like, I guess I'd be curious about like what the sensitivity. I mean, that would be unfortunate, by the way, because we get a lot less information. Um, but whether we'd see improved response rates on certain very high importance variables with a shorter survey.
Yeah. I was talking to, uh, I say this with love, the Bloomberg people this morning, and we were going through the jobs report as it came out live. And, we were trying to interpret the Black unemployment rate, which, if you look at the Black unemployment rate over the last 2 years, it went through a big jump and it has since fallen. And there's this kind of very easy, not in like a accusational way, but there's this kind of easy interpretation of like, well, it's a subgroup for a falling response. So that means that, uh, the standard error is getting big. And even if the Black unemployment rate is rising, we don't really have, like, we don't know if that's just the error rate of the data that went through this like bump and decline we saw in the Black unemployment rate. But that is, in fact, the perfect case for stronger public surveys. Because if, when our public surveys decline, y'all, we're not going to miss the white unemployment rate for decades. Every group whose unemployment rate or labor force participation rate or wage rate is going to be erased. It is going to start with the smallest and least powerful groups, where that's just like, well, looks like Black people lost jobs, but we don't know. And as soon as you don't trust the data of Black unemployment rate, you have basically stopped monitoring the Black unemployment rate. So this ordering to the public surveys losing their trustability and their integrity, and people assuming that the standard errors are getting larger and we don't know what the number means, that is not like it hits the whole survey. It hits parts of the survey, and it will hit parts of the survey for the least vulnerable people. And it is one of the biggest arguments for why Revelio and ADP will always be just so incredibly inferior to public sector data, because the public sector is representative of people and these other data sets are not, and they can't be, and they don't value it.
Yeah.
And the market wants to know what happened to payroll, employment, and construction and manufacturing. The market is not moving on the Black unemployment rate. Advocates are. So that's who loses from these surveys being put, basically put out to pasture and not cared about by your members of Congress anymore. But coming up on the top of the hour, I just like, that came up this morning and I was like, Bloomberg terminal subscribers, here's what you need to know about public servants. Um,
No, but actually, there's a very specific case of this that is recent that is prominent, right? Labor economists have all trained everybody to look at prime working age employment population ratio. It's been our like drumbeat over the last 15 years. Um, and it suddenly plunged by a huge amount last month, even as the rest of the report looked pretty good, or at least the household survey looked pretty good. And the question is, what do you make of this? And then you looked at it, and it was like almost entirely driven by like 25, 34-year-olds. Somebody who I talked to was like, actually, Guy, I looked at it. It's not just 25, 34-year-olds, it's 25 and 29-year-olds. So that is a classic, like, kind of thing that you would see, like a small number of respondents can cause weird variation of that nature, and that problem becomes more severe the more you sort of like underfund and under-resource the survey. Like, you're just gonna get more weird events and behaviors in key series that sometimes become significant, like they did last month. I mean, we're still kind of looking at that and are like, should we interpret this labor market getting worse or not? Even though it looks really weird in a lot of respects. And I think that's sort of it. Like, that seems to me like an example of what you're saying, where it suddenly starts rising to, wow, people that care about that, don't care about what's going on in the labor market, but do care about the way the labor market's affecting their money, probably should care about too. And to tie it into the private sector data providers, I love having those data as private data sector providers. A nice complement and helps shape it, but they are not able. The BLS provides that detail in a way that these folks never will be able to do effectively. Or I'm very skeptical because they have it. And it's not to hate on them. It's just an extremely difficult thing to do well. It takes years of practice and discipline on methodology that is very having done this, I work producing macroeconomic data on behalf of the private sector. Like, it's hard. You don't have the history, you don't have the institutional knowledge, you don't have the resourcing. We're gonna really miss it one day. I mean, I'm maybe doing a premature obituary that I hope never comes true,
Ugh.
but I get very sad thinking about it.
No, I'm ready for Stats 3.0, the big beautiful BLS, the one big beautiful BLS. Yeah, I'm here for it. It's coming because we need it, and eventually, like, very powerful people in finance will actually say, like, "Oh, we do need better public data," and then we'll get it. Not all voices are equal. That's unfortunate. Okay, so we're coming at the top of the hour. I think this was an experiment between me and Guy, and if you guys like it, please let us know if we should do this again next month for Jobs Day, and we can, I would assume, always preach about the wonder and importance of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but we could also talk about other things. I mean, some topics that come to mind, not just from this report, would be, we've got an election coming up in the midterms, and like summer looking this bad. I've got like certain questions about which data series I think might be most impactful as people are kind of suffering in the run up to this. I kind of always perennially have a question about that. And, always also for the past like 3 years of like, so is this a recession? Oh, wait, Benga says we need to do one on the Fed. Okay, any other work we can do for you, Benga? Yeah, we could talk about the Fed. The Fed is going through lots of things. We could talk about elections. We could talk more about immigration. But y'all send us things that you want to hear about in relation to the jobs report. But I think overall, this is just another weak, bad report in a confusing, weak, bad labor market. Todd, do you have final thoughts?
Nothing. I don't. I guess my feeling is that next month, I think the report's going to be confusing in the opposite direction. We're going to see somewhat better job growth, and we're going to see the unemployment move in the other direction.
Oh my God, wait, why do you think that?
Because I just don't think that we're in a losing jobs every month environment. I mean, the other way it could become most confusing is, in fact, that we keep losing jobs and then part go up. I just don't see this combination sustainable in the long run. And my bet is that's going to the actual like combination next 6 months is going to be somewhere in the middle with these, with very lackluster positive job growth, and that part being flattish or heading slowly up.
Well,
My
we've seen
opinion,
that.
Iberger's hot take that in a month you can all come in and say, "Guy, you were totally wrong. We got the exact same jobs before, and
But
now choices."
it's a good note to leave on, that whatever we're in now can't be the trends because it's not compatible. It's not compatible for the number of jobs to go down and the unemployment rate to also go down.
By a
That's
lot for a
Yeah,
single month.
no, that is absolutely not compatible. So something has to break in either direction. And I feel like this is not the first month where this has happened. And we're going to see, I don't know. I mean, maybe it just keeps on correcting, but something has to be different next month. You know what? Actually, I feel like that's a prediction that both you and I can feel comfortable with. Something has to be different next month.
Yeah, exactly. And the
Thank,
safest forecast we'll ever make.
yeah. Thanks you guys for coming. This was so
Thank you.
fun.
It was awesome.
I
Bye,
think that
guys.
I think I just hit end and then I think it ends.